Hello and welcome to the Anyone Can Play Guitar podcast,
which gives you, the listener, a series of hints and pointers on your journey as a musical artist,
providing you with interviews from those in the music industry, along with our own experiences.
Ben and James shine some light on the many pitfalls and opportunities that being a musician has to offer.
Last week we were backstage with Mark Morris of the Blue Tones, talking to him about repartee, crowdfunding and the importance of musicians getting paid. This week we head to Manchester to speak with musician, author, former label owner and now music lecturer Pete Dale. Here we cover the benefits of self-releasing music, the importance of physical song releases, how to choose acts for a label, and label identity. Welcome to episode 14 with me, James, and him,
Ben. Do you know what I like about this episode, James? Well, the next two episodes.
I don't.
Is the fact it was a recommendation from a previous one.
Yes, thank you to Mark Duffett.
Yes.
Should be noted for putting us in touch with Pete, and also that I hadn't even joined the dots at the time.
Yeah, that
Ross had mentioned, and the whole Milky Whim shake was Pete.
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
In the first place, so two
seemed like an ideal guest then, really, didn't
well,
he?
Well, he was, really.
Yeah, exactly.
Which worked well.
So this is quite a good one because it answers a lot of questions I had about record companies and doing it yourself. And like when I thought about it back, we did quite a bit ourselves, as in like hearing an interview that you did, because I was AWOL, can't remember where I was that night. We like the printing of covers, the cutting out of covers, the sticking the plastic nipples on, and then the CD burning and all that sort of stuff.
We should clarify plastic nipples for the audience.
Go on then, James. Tell me what they were if they weren't plastic nipples.
I'm not disputing that that's what they were. I think it's just worth pointing out that they were the sort of circular plastic thing that went onto, in our case, often a piece of cardboard, which then folded around into a beautiful end product that a CD would then clip on top of. Yes.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, just wanted to clarify.
Mm-hmm. But Pete, yes, he had his own label back in the day, independent label, but he does go through a lot of good points and bad points of why being a label, why not being a label, why do it yourself, why have that control.
I mean, we like any number of other independent artists, where you've got to do it all yourself, really, unless you pull other people in, and whether it's friends or others, beg, borrowing favours and all the rest of it. You know, you've got to.
You're almost like a mini record company, anyway, aren't you, when you're doing it yourself?
The main thing I took from it was that I want to start a label.
I knew you were going to say that. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely doable, and you just got to have the right people on there. But the thing is, we'll get back into it at the end about the whole, do you want a label, do you not want a label? But I found it very interesting, and because you did this one, it was one I could listen to and go, I don't have to, like,
was that your response when I sent it through to you?
Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah.
Good. Right, well,
it's part one.
Part one again, well, yes.
You love a double header. I
do indeed, and I think so. When we first started this, when I was first speaking to Pete before we started recording, his opening gambit was my internet connection's playing up a bit. I thought, oh no. So,
I didn't realise that.
But thankfully, I think that there are maybe 2 points that it goes a bit wobbly, but it's just for a few seconds. So
I can't remember it. No.
It wasn't a problem, and it held good. So yeah, Pete was great with his time, so we had enough to split into a two-parter, and let's just crack on now with part one.
Excellent.
So Pete, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
Well, thank you very much for your time. So I guess for our listeners, if we just kick off, if you could give them a little bit of your backstory and history in music.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Kent, in the southeast of England, near Ashford, but I moved up to the northeast actually when I was 18 in the very end of the 80s, And so I was in bands and stuff when I was at school in Kent, but then I got into a more serious band in Sunderland when I was studying there, and that was a group called Razorblade Smile, and we used to play in Newcastle and in Sunderland, and then we started to get gigs further afield in Leeds and in London, and eventually got a record out in 91, which was a 7-inch single that came out on a fledgling indie label called Chocolate Narcotic back in those days. We did a couple of singles for them, and then we did a 12-inch mini LP on a label called Sugar Frost in 93, probably. I think it came out in early 93. But for various reasons, I decided to leave that band, and it ended up splitting up because I'd left. So I left in the summer of 93, at which time I decided to set up my own record label, and I did that for about 8 years, where we put out singles. We started off putting out tapes, we put out cassettes, and then later vinyl singles, vinyl albums, CDs eventually, and we would sell reasonable quantities for the period. You know, we could sell, sometimes we would print 800 copies, and then we would have to go into a second pressing of things and maybe press another 500. So typically we'd sell between 500 and 1,500 copies of a record.
Okay.
So yeah, I did that for a number of years. We put out the first single by a group called Kaniki, whose vocalist Lauren Laverne went on to be a TV personality. We also did the first single by Yummy Fur, who were linked to, well, later on 2 members of Yummy Fur went on to form Franz Ferdinand. We put out a bunch of different bands, but then I decided to become a school music teacher in the early noughties, and eventually started doing a master's and then a PhD in music while I was working in a secondary school teaching music. And about 5 years ago, I took up academic work lecturing in Oxford Brookes University, and then more recently in Manchester Metropolitan University. So that's basically the potted history.
No, good stuff. Some interesting stuff in there. I hadn't even realised Lauren Laverne was in a band. Right. Well,
yeah. They were quite big for a while. We put their record out in '95. They shortly after they signed to EMI, and they were on top of the pops, and you know, they were reasonably successful for a while. But then they broke up in '98, which is when she got into the kind of TV stuff.
Interesting. So, lots of things to get into, and I think one of the main things that we're keen to get you on the podcast to talk about was the whole setting up of your own label, because there'll be various people listening to our podcast who, you know, getting the record deal would be an amazing thing, or potentially a target, a goal. And for a lot of them thinking, right, well, could we actually set up our label? And I'd imagine a lot of people would think, well, you know what? That sounds amazing. That sounds brilliant. And then a lot of other people would say, that sounds quite daunting, or that's something that would be out of our reach, and you know, we would never be able to do that. So I guess to start with, you know, why might someone consider doing this? You know, why is it worth setting up a label to release your own music?
Well, you know, so starting with the positive side of it, it means that you can completely be your own boss. So you don't have to, you know, negotiate things with an outside third party. You know, when we were on small DIY indie labels, before I started up my own label, every time we made a record, there was a kind of process of making a demo version, negotiating with the label about which songs would be released, maybe kind of, you know, other kinds of negotiations. And of course, if you go for a bigger label, then they might invest money in your band, but then they expect you to kind of follow their promotional idea of what's best. For me, I was always very, you know, I felt like I wanted to self-manage, and I think you're right that some people might say, oh, it's too daunting, and I'd rather just hand over responsibility to a third party. But the advantage of being completely in control is that you know that it's done properly. Whereas a lot of bands historically a lot of bands have been signed to big labels when they've had a reasonable following in the kind of indie alternative scene, and then once they get signed, the label messes it up for them, doesn't promote them in a way that actually plays out well with the existing fan base, and it ends up going badly, and the band gets dropped and ends up splitting up. You see this process happen a lot. If you're in control of it yourself, you're releasing your own music, then it gives you that complete artistic control, but also ability to kind of make sure that the business side of things is done well. It means that, of course, you don't have the muscle, as it were, that the big labels have with pluggers and with promoters who can get the stuff reviewed in the papers, can get it played on the radio and things like that. But you can actually do those things yourself by just taking on those roles, which is exactly what we did in the 90s. We would mail off copies to Radio 1 DJs and usually got a pretty good response. And, we would mail off copies to the NME and the other music papers of the day, and they would review the records. And so it was possible for us to do it, ourselves. And I liked doing that. You can make money as well, which is one of the other advantages, where, it's harder to make money because if you're signed to a label, they tend to give you an advance, which actually puts you into debt, and you maybe never see a penny of the profit that gets made on your record because it all disappeared from that initial advance. But the whole industry has changed so much since the 90s that the idea of getting signed to a label is, it's very, very hard to do that now. And if you start by putting your own music out, it means you can actually get things kick-started. That might lead might lead you to getting signed later on, but at least it means that you got some music out there in the first place, which is, really, in the days before the internet was available like it is now, it meant you could actually have some music for people to listen to.
Oh, that's sort of interesting, and it leads into another sort of question, which is, at what point might somebody think about setting up their own label? Because as you've sort of touched on, not just with the internet, but with technology today, it's a lot easier to record something as a musical artist today than it ever was in the past. So at what point, I'm guessing, once you've written one song, is probably not the point where you'd think, right, and we're going to set up our own record label. When might be a good point for a band or a solo artist to think, maybe this could be something I want to look into?
Yeah, it's difficult to say, isn't it? What's the correct and best point for a band to release its own stuff and maybe to look at releasing other people's stuff, which is what I did. I set up the label with someone else who I was making music with, but as well as releasing our own music, we released other people's music, and that was really good for us because it meant we had a kind of label identity, which helped people to sort of see that we were. People might buy one release on the label and then think, okay, I'll buy something else. But anyway, whether you want to do it just for your own band or want to do it as part of a packaged along with other bands sort of thing, the question of when is the time to start thinking about that is difficult to say. I would say, though, given that the availability of Bandcamp in particular, and websites like that, it can make good sense to make things available through a digital download with a view to subsequently maybe having a physical release. It is a tough call with that. Physical releases these days, be it CDs or vinyl, it is much harder to sell them. And, 20 years ago even, certainly 25 years ago, it was not difficult to sell 500 records, and you could sell 1,500 with a bit of effort. But these days, I think a lot of the people I talk to struggle to sell 200 or 300, and people maybe making a 7-inch vinyl single, and they can only sell a very small quantity, 100 or even, well, if you only sell 100, it's going to be very hard to cover the costs and recoup the costs. In fact, you probably won't be able to when you're only selling 100. You need to really sell 200 or 300 just to break even, and even then it can be quite tough. But having a physical product does give a certain credibility, and it does help to make the music seem more significant to not only audiences but also to industry people. So I think where I work, I teach on a popular music degree, and we recently had a masterclass with a speaker called John Esplin, who is actually based in Newcastle on Tyne, and he suggested that quite a good way to go is to do a couple of individual releases of like one song, do one, try and get people to pay attention to it through whatever means you can, online, social media, and whatever methods you can find to promote it, make a YouTube video, that kind of thing. Maybe do another one that's an actual, has no physical release, and then after you've done 2 or maybe 3, then look at trying to do physical releases, forming into more of a kind of traditional record label. That's what he recommended, and I think that probably is good advice.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And I also, one of the things you said, that the physical product bringing a bit of credibility, that sort of resonates. I remember that when myself and Ben were in a band, which was sort of going back to early to mid noughties, the point where we had a sort of an actual physical CD. I mean, it was at the time where we could still do free downloads, but it did feel like it brought a bit of legitimacy to it. It felt real, and that might sound a bit weird, but it did sound, it certainly felt like we had something tangible that we could give to people or send off to people. So it's interesting that there's still that sort of credibility element to industry type people.
It definitely is the case. I mean, for example, most of my music has been in the kind of indie punk kind of area. One of my colleagues is a jazz musician, and he makes a point of getting his music available at least on CD, because he told me that most of the important jazz magazines like Jazz Wise, The Wire, things like that, they won't review an album unless it has a physical release, So that shows you one example of how it has this sort of aura of being more real than a download,
Yeah, no, it makes sense. I mean, equally, we had Mark Radcliffe on a previous episode, and he said he only listens to things on a CD. That's him. So if people give him a link to download something, he typically won't do it. He puts things on, he listens in his car and his CD player. That's how he goes about doing it. So if someone wanted to get onto BBC Six Music, they're not going to do it unless there's a physical CD that they're going to send to Mark, or at least for his show on that station. So it does definitely still seem to be a thing.
Yeah, interesting though, because I've had heard other people, such as a guy called Terry Ellis, who set up Chrysalis Records in the 70s, that put out a bunch of Blondie albums that sold millions of copies, and loads of Jethro Tull and other bands that were on Chrysalis, so a big industry player. And he told me that nowadays, he hates it if people give him a CD, and he'd much rather they just gave him the info for a download, because the CD just feels like a burden to him. Where's he going to put it? It's just going to end up being thrown out, and it seems wasteful to him. So, it's probably not the same across the board. It depends on the industry person that you're dealing with.
Totally. I think the key there is for people to understand the person that they're sending it to, and find out what their preference is, definitely. So there was another bit you mentioned earlier which I thought was interesting, and I think I get the logic of, if someone was to set a label up not only to sell their own records but to also bring other bands on board. How did you go about choosing other artists to put onto your label at the time when you were running it?
Well, we were very much in a niche. We were lucky because John Peel was still alive, and he would play records that nobody else would play on Radio 1. And so we were putting out our own music. It was pretty lo-fi. It was pretty rough and ready. Some people would even call it amateurish, and we didn't mind being amateurish because amateur, as we would often point out, the root of the word amateur is amor, to love, and amateur does it for the love, and we kind of saw that as what we were doing. We were kind of like into the idea of being fans that were having a go. So it was quite easy for us to have a USP, as people would say today, which was that we were covering the kind of lo-fi, punky, indie, alternative stuff that was very amateurish. And so we found bands locally in the northeast. I was based most of the time in Newcastle upon Tyne, and for example, people would send us cassettes. And I remember we got a cassette from a teenage school band in Morpeth, which I later found out they'd recorded it in the music room on their lunch hour at school. But, we liked it, and we just said, oh, fine, we'll put up a single. We paid for them to put them into a studio, and we pressed up 500 copies, sold them out within 6 months, deleted the single, and moved on to doing something else. And, they were very kind of like... this was about 94, and they had this sound which bands like Truman's Water and Pavement had at that time. So, also there was the Riot Girl thing happening around that time, and we were interested in putting out girl bands. Some of the bands that we put out, like Kaniki, which was this all-girl band with Lauren Laverne on vocals, we basically, they were just some girls from Sunderland who were coming to the gigs that we were putting on, and we encouraged them to start a band because we thought it was really good for them to do a band, because we knew Marie liked the guitar. So sometimes it would be that we would actually fabricate the bands ourselves in a way by persuading our friends to make some music. Other times it would be cassettes that we would get through the post. So the Yummy Fur, who I mentioned earlier, two of whom went on to be in Franz Ferdinand, they were in Glasgow, but they just sent us a tape, and we listened to the tape and thought this was like really great stuff. So again, we called them up on the phone and told them that we'd like them to come down and record in Newcastle, which they did. And I think we pressed 1,000 copies of that single and immediately sold those out. So we made another 500, and over time we sold the second pressing as well. And then we deleted the record at that point, but then we did an album with them after that, which sold pretty well as well. So yeah, basically we started because we had created this kind of label identity through the artwork on the early releases that we had on the label, which stuck out as being really quite different artwork and pretty lo-fi, rough and ready production on the recordings. People could see the kind of stuff that we were going to put out on the label, and that meant that bands from around the country and from other countries started sending us demo tapes, and we could kind of pick and choose what we wanted to put out. I mean, there were demo tapes of bands that went on to, be quite notable bands, but that we turned them down, actually. But, I mean, people like Sleater Kinney, for example, they never tried to get on a label, but we had a relationship with them from when Corinne from Sleater Kinney was in Heavens to Betsy, which was her band before Sleater Kinney, and we organised a load of gigs around the UK for them in 1994. So bands that we could have probably tried to get on the label, we kind of passed up on them, and in retrospect, later on, probably thought, okay, we maybe could have had that band and made some money, but you just never know at the time who's going to be a significant band and who isn't. It's all very good with the benefit of hindsight. I do think that if somebody was going to start a label and they were trying to not just have the label as a vanity project for their own music, but instead were trying to have a stable of artists, which is really what makes a record label. You know, a record label isn't supposed to be just for one band. Then, you know, a good the USP, as people put it now, the unique selling point, is quite important. And things like having a label logo that's on all the releases, and maybe other aspects of design, which people in record shops can kind of, you know, see the record and think, oh yeah, it's another one on that label, you know. And there are ways of doing that. Of course, it can be difficult to, you know, some bands really want to have their own design, which doesn't fit with a label design approach, and those kind of things have to be negotiated carefully. But if you can have a kind of visual identity and a musical identity across a stable of bands, it can work really well, and it certainly worked well for us.
No, that's something I want to touch on, because you mentioned earlier on that some of your experience, you know, with some of the bigger labels that can be quite controlling, and you know, even to the point of sort of choosing songs or dismissing other songs that would potentially go on an album. And again, you've just sort of referenced there, you know, when it comes to artwork, the same sort of negotiations can sometimes have to happen. How did that play out when you were sort of on the other side of the fence and sort of running the label? You know, how much freedom, you know, did you give to artists versus potentially the element that you wanted to control to create that label identity? You know, where did you strike that balance?
It's a good question. We aimed to give a huge amount of freedom to the groups, and we did give a lot of freedom to the groups, because we were careful in the first instance to kind of choose groups to work with that were already on, you know, the right kind of bands to fit with us. There was one occasion I can remember, which is a good example of the tension that you've just been kind of talking about, where there was a group called Kodiak, who we put out a single by them, and it didn't do brilliantly, actually. We pressed 1,000 copies, and it never sold. That was one of the ones that never sold out. In retrospect, we probably pressed too many, and I still have 40 or 50 copies of that record, which, you know, nobody wants it 20 years later, because it's just an old record, you know, and they never really got a lot of attention, although we did manage to get some press and radio play for them. Anyway, despite their poor sales, we decided we liked them and we wanted to do an album with them. But they, when they were recording the album, re-recorded I think they re-recorded both of the two songs that had been on the single, and they wanted to put them on the album. And we were very unhappy with this, because we had a kind of ideology of not putting singles on albums, because that way we figured, you know, it was better value for the people who were buying the records if they buy a single. You know, they haven't wasted their money. Same songs are on the album. But that was quite difficult, because we basically asked them not to put the singles on the album, and they were very unhappy with that. And I think actually in the end, we persuaded a different label to take the record on and put the album out, because you know, the band seemed to be unhappy with our stipulation, and we were, you know, didn't really want to compromise. So yeah, I persuaded a different label to take it on. So yeah, but generally it worked. You know, generally we were able to give the artistic freedom to the bands that we wanted to.
Right then, there we go.
Mm-hmm. I got a lot from that. I took a lot of
good
notes down. I was trying to think of what dealings we had with record companies, just as a frame of reference. It wasn't that much, but we did have what was that? I'm not going to name the company because I can't remember it exactly, but we did a battle of the bands for a record company, and it kind of came through as a join our record company and we'll do a battle of the bands, but it was really to promote two other bands. Good move by them, because they had lots of bands playing and showcasing their other bands who weren't part of this battle of the band thing. So it was a clever move, but
there was others. I guess in my mind it depends how you define label in many ways. So we did a mini tour under the banner of a particular label. Now this was almost, you know, it'll have been one or two people probably out of their back room without really having any infrastructure, but just got us a few gigs and sort of did a mini tour of the UK type thing.
And there's a CD as well, like stuff printed and...
Yeah, so there was lots of little bits and pieces. But again, to the point you made before we started the episode, I think there's a lot of stuff that we did and were able to do quite well.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of things that we just weren't. And to give an example of that, so we had some pretty decent physical products.
Yes.
And it was interesting to hear from Pete that it sort of gave that bit of credibility, the physical product. And I guess today when you've got... It's so easy to just do a download. It could almost be a bit of a differentiating factor that, they've got whether it's a CD or a vinyl or whatever, there's that physical...
Cassettes are coming back in.
Are they?
A little bit. I've saw a couple
coming
kicking
back
about.
In where?
Some, like, whatever it is, it's come back in. They know
like a USB cassette player in the same way you'd have a USB turntable.
Maybe, but people are releasing cassettes. I don't think it'll last very long, Jim. Don't worry about it. But, having said that though, if you are at a gig or something and they're giving out cassettes, like, a cassette... It makes you stops you and makes you think, doesn't it?
I can sort of get vinyl still, because you can get some good modern ones, but cassettes were just it was just a pain in the arse.
Maybe Walkmans are making a comeback, James.
I'm not buying it.
Don't? You've got an iPod.
I bought one years ago.
Yeah,
I need another one.
Anyway, yeah.
But yeah, I think there is. It was interesting in the sense that it's almost anyone can create a song and put up a digital download these days, but not everyone could potentially produce a physical CD product. So I found that interesting that it does still give a bit of credibility in some instances. And going back to the Mark Radcliffe point,
you just took that out my mouth.
But
it's a key. Yeah,
it's a key
thing.
I'm sure you've had that before.
Yeah. But for someone like Mark, a CD is what he likes.
Yeah. But again, he wasn't bothered whether it was a blank CD or with a name written on in a Sharpie, or whether it was a beautifully polished thing. Other people will be different. But then again, Pete was saying that one of his friends who runs another label was like, I just want downloads. I just want a link these days.
Yeah.
I don't want my house cluttered up with all these physical products. So
because they'll soon add up. Because I found a bag which was just full of demos we've got of other bands when we were in the band, and they do stack up really quickly. And we were just another band. We weren't a label. So I can understand that why you want a link. It's just easier. But personally, I'd have the CD. A couple of things that Pete said, which I thought is worth mentioning. The control aspect of it. So if
that's the big thing, isn't it?
Yeah, because if you're on a indie label, or your own label, or no label, or a major label, obviously it dilutes depending on what you want to achieve and what the company want to get out of you. If you think of someone like Oasis, they never really had a major label. They went on Creation, then they went on Big Brother. They had other labels like Sony with distribution and stuff like that, but Alan McGee gave them pretty much free rein on their creative control, as did R.E.M. before they did sign a major label. They went with a certain company because they did give them the same creative control to do the artwork how they wanted to do it, the song order, all the stuff that they didn't want the company to get involved in, because if you don't, it dilutes, and before you know it, you're not writing the songs that you wrote in your bedroom when you were...
Well, this comes back to what I was... Because I started talking about the things that we did fairly well, which was being able to produce a fairly professional-looking physical product in a CD. But what we weren't good, and I think Pete used the word, the muscle of the big labels.
I've written that down, yeah.
We weren't good at the promoting, in the sense of our promotion was to friends of friends, I think, which we've mentioned before. We didn't have that reach that a label can do, and that, I think, that's one of the big differences for me. You almost have to decide how much creative control you're willing to sacrifice to allow for what a label can do for you.
It's very rare that you see an unsigned band or a self-managed band like headlining a major festival, for example, or getting a tour with whoever. It's all like that. Indie label or major label will always give you more muscle or give you more contacts or give you more exposure. But it makes you from something that you're passionate about to having a job with to being mega multi-millionaires, Coldplay style type of band. It's the whole degree of, depending on how much exposure you have with your label, how big you are going to get. It's rare that you're going to get a very...
Well...
But then again, Arctic Monkeys, they were on an independent... They did a lot themselves, got on a Domino independent label, and they're still on it now.
Yeah.
And they've done all right.
Again, I'm not going to profess to be an expert on their backstory, but from reading things on them, they were almost at the point of just giving it up. And it was just through friends who then were friends of friends and then became fans and friends of fans that just literally burning CD after CD, just, passing them around. So it wasn't any good quality finished product. It was just passing things around, and that's how it spread. So it's, back to the word of mouth thing. It can happen, and it has happened in the not too recent past, but they're probably the exception rather than the way that it generally goes. But on the sort of the bit that I really liked, I think, which started to make sense for me, which I hadn't really thought much about, was when we're talking about, again, you give up certain levels of creative control to a label and they bring other things to the table. So it's not just that the reach, the publicity, all the rest of it, but that identity of the label. It was interesting to hear from Pete from a label's perspective to say, well, you know what, we wanted the artwork to be in a certain style because then you knew it was our label. Mm-hmm. And that whole brand identity sort of makes sense, because then if you're a band going onto that label and then your artwork, you see it wherever on a poster or in a shop or online or wherever, and you can just make that association straight away, it's a certain style brand, then I can understand that would be a good thing that a label would want to almost enforce to the acts in their stable, I think, as he called it. Whereas if you're in the band, you might be thinking, oh, well, no, I want to make the artwork however I want the artwork to be, type thing, and I don't want this, that and the other. And so it was interesting to hear it from that other side. Yeah. Because I wouldn't have liked that much. I guess if someone was like, well, I really want the artwork to be this, but the label are now saying, nah, this is how it's going to be. But in the bigger picture, that could be better for you. Yeah, if they're paying your bills. Or worse, because, if the artwork that the label chooses is not something that fits, it might be an image that doesn't fit with the ideals and values of you, which we've talked about with Mark Duffert, then, that could put a lot of people off. So, it is a very fine balance, I think. It is, because if you think about it, you've got 5 bands on a label, and let's say one of them happens to be Arctic Monkeys, and then you see, similar artwork, it's got like certain design on the corner that makes it this record company, Arctic Monkeys are good, I'll buy that, work in your favour. Other way around, you've got someone who just absolutely is this absolute dog, and you think, well, they've got them on the label, I ain't buying it. So that's a very good point, that. I've not really thought about that. If you're on a label and some new band gets signed to your label and you really don't like them, that they're at odds to what you stand for, but you're tied into a 3-album deal, and now so are they. yeah, exactly. So, I mean, if you get to the big labels, which have got like hundreds and hundreds on the roster, that probably doesn't matter at that point. Oh, well, yeah, and that's a fair point. But if you are a label of even 10 bands, and you think, they're on our label, no, because at one point you might be going out on tour with them. Yeah. Well, exactly. Because that's going to be a long, however many months. Exactly, yeah. And if you're making money, maybe it might take the edge off it a bit, but there'll be a tipping point where you think, I can't deal with these people anymore. Definitely. Well, it's a good point. Yeah, and I know we've kind of jumped around a lot of things. It's just a lot of consideration with a lot of these episodes that we do, but this one, there's lots of considerations about
do you want a label? Do you want to just be down the line, arty, full control? If something happens, something happens. But I want full control. I want to say what I want. I want to be called what I want.
But then you've got to do it all. Back to the Mr. B. Well, I might get round to do my invoices. I might not.
Exactly. Yeah. But then, do you think, well, I could sign to an album, an indie label that are similar ideals, and they might take a bit of the legwork off us. I can play with the other bands that I enjoy.
And it frees you up to do more
practice, more songwriting,
practice,
more recording. Yeah. Or do I go to someone like Domino or Creation, who'll do a lot more, but they're going to get a big chunk of my money.
Well, that's the other element.
And they may get a chunk of my creativity. I mean, those two labels, I'm not going to say that again then, because they do give a lot of creativity to their artists. But as an example.
Yeah.
But then you could go to someone absolutely massive who are going to say, no, we're going to release an album, you're going to tour for a year, you're going to come back and I want 3 singles off it, I want it to sound like this artist in the charts.
Yeah.
Yeah, so, this Adele person, she's doing all right, make your song. We're an indie band.
Your next song has to sound like this. Well, and that's it.
Which I understand because they're making multi-millions, but then, did you get in it for that reason? Some people do. Great.
Yeah.
Some people don't. So you've got to get that fine line. And depending on where you are in that chain, really depends how much work you do.
Mm.
Yeah, because you can make, as you said, even with the smallest labels, you can make a bit of money, but you're going to be up most of the night sticking labels on CDs or on vinyls, pressing them, putting them in, send them off.
Well, I'd imagine at that point you're paying someone to...
Maybe, depending on...
But again, it all comes out the profit margins.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, lots of pros and cons, I think, is the overall summary there.
But one of the things he did say was that you've got to watch out for is that if the label messes up and then you get dropped and then you split up. He said there's been countless bands like that, and he's right. There's loads. I could probably look for my CD collection of 1-2 album bands and go, what happened to that band? Yeah. They were brilliant. And
well, I wonder if a better approach almost is if you're really good and you get the opportunity to sign to a label, I guess if someone throws a 5-album deal or whatever in front of you, it could be really tempting to take it. But if you are that good, then I'll have 1 album, thanks.
Yeah.
And if it goes well and we like the partnership,
it's a rolling contract.
Well, yeah, and then we'll take it from there. But again, it comes back to how good your negotiating skills are. I mean, if you're an 18-year-old who's new, I mean, God,
I would like to see you do it, 18.
Can you imagine? You would have just taken the 5-album deal there and then, wouldn't you?
Or we're getting 3%. Well, that's all right.
It's just given you need some sensible voices, I guess, giving you the sort of the balanced view on.
Definitely, and I think that's actually not a bad idea about taking the 1-album deal, because if you are a band and that album happens to be Arctic Monkeys' first album, then you don't need the company because you are the company now.
Well, that's if it's working well for both people, then you might decide you want to stay together. Yeah. If it's not, then
it's all about
no one's
cuts
tied
and,
into anything. But
because I was back when we were definitely when we first started out, definitely when we got that little run, well, 2 or 3 years in, when we had a lot of stuff going on, it was all about the deal, and now I don't think you need the deal as much because you can do a pretty good demo in your room.
It depends, like again, if you're the sort of people who can pull the various equipment together and record something, you've got someone in the band who's good at musical arrangement, someone who wants to edit it all, etc., 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 then...
Well, there's a guest we'll be talking to soon.
But if you're all awful at that, then...
Yeah. Personally, if I was to do it again, I probably would still look for a deal because it'll take you to that next step. Whether that next step to us was just making a career out of it.
Yeah.
Not earning millions, but earning enough to have a sensible career, playing festivals, playing across the world. That might just be enough. But then there might be some people who go, I don't want that. I want to have 5 number 1 albums, all platinum, playing stadiums across the country. Yeah, I don't mind doing a few songs that aren't my thing.
That's the thing. I'm thinking there's few bands, artists who get signed to a label will play stadiums and stuff. That's a very small percentage at the very top of the tree.
But if you're someone like Mr. B, who we've already spoken to, he does a lot of it himself, and he's got his crowd, he's got his career, he's liked with his audience. And when he started out, I'm sure he would have took it on day one. This is what we'll give you. You can play all year round. You can do an album most years. Getting to meet some cool people. You're going to earn an all right living from it. I don't know how much he earns. I don't really care, to be honest. But
enough to see him and his family.
Yeah,
good,
exactly. Yeah, he pretty well went. Yeah, I'll take that. Yeah. Same with Mark Morris. He has a couple of months with the Blue Tones, a couple of weeks with the Blue Tones, depending on the size of the tour. There's a lot of stuff himself. Probably at the heyday of the Blue Tones, he might have been saying, I want to be like this forever, maybe. But right now, I bet you'd be like, yeah, I'll take this. I'll take this for another 15 years. Because everywhere I play, I get a decent crowd, have a bit of crack on with the audience.
I think there's a bit of building the skills up as well, because even if you do say you're in a big band for however long, again, it's very few bands that would stay that big for that long. Mm-hmm. That's, again, a tiny percentage. So chances are, if your band does quite well for a small period of time, you might then want to do something solo or independent later in your career. So if you've got a lot of the skills under your belt to prepare you for that, so once you've gone through perhaps the whole label thing and then you come out the other end, you're not just left, oh no, I haven't got a clue. I'm now a bit older. I don't want to start from scratch, and learn all of this.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, there's lots and lots of bits to it. But if we really start music tomorrow and someone came around and went, fancy 5-album deal, I would definitely take it.
Well, that's
because on a different
lucky for you, I'd be sitting there going, no, Ben, no, we're not going to.
It would have to be the right label, the right artistic.
Well, yeah, hopefully a bit older and wiser and would ask more questions and would find something that worked for us.
Yeah. So, overall, James, I would say there's a lot of bits in there which I enjoyed.
Just bits.
Yeah. I'm changing the lexicon here, James. Lots of, trying to think of another word, but I can't. Lots of bits, points, key aspects, key features, parts to it. And I think Pete gave it, because he's been there and he gave out the whole thing, because he was an artist, he was done it as a label as well. He's seen all the bits of it. There's definitely merit to do it alone. There's definitely merit to do it independent labels. There's definitely merit to doing it major labels. It's just, as a lot of these things, there's work involved. Got to think about it, but definitely read the small print.
Up next week, we stay in Manchester for part 2 with Pete. Here we talk about vinyl, the costs of releasing a single, and the time involved in actually running a label.
We've reached the end of this week's episode of Anyone Can Play Guitar podcast.
Big thank you for tuning in, and remember to stop by iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts from and subscribe so that you never miss an episode.
While you're there, it would be amazing if you could leave a rating and a review.
All the show notes can be found at www.acpgmusic.com, and if you want to get in touch,
email us your questions, any feedback and any suggestions to info@acpgmusic.com.
That's it for now. Keep supporting upcoming artists,
and we'll catch you next time.